Hey, Warrior Saints. Greg Abdullah here, coming to you live from St. George in Phoenix. We're going to be simulcasting today on the Antiochian Archdiocese Missions and Evangelism page. So if you hear a little bit of silence from the usually means that there's something going on in the Facebook. So feel free to check out this very same stream live on the Antiochian Missions and Evangelism's page. I'll do my best to repeat everything as best I can, especially any questions that come in, so that you guys know what's going on, what's being answered. Our class today is called Don't Stop Believing, A Journey Through the Divine Liturgy. And it is part 1 of 4 that we will be doing over the next 4 Mondays in partnership with the Antiochian Archdiocese's Department of Missions and Evangelism. Really excited to have you here with us today. I am here at St. George in Phoenix. That is correct. I think we're good to go. Let's get rolling. Awesome. So welcome to the first of our series, Don't Stop Believing, A Journey Through the Divine Liturgy. Today is going to be our kind of introduction, part 1, kind of laying the foundation for what we're actually going to be looking at when we talk about the Divine Liturgy over the next few weeks. The Divine Liturgy, as many of us know, is the entirety, not the entirety, that's not a fair way to say it. It is the basis for kind of everything that we do as Orthodox Christians. It, as we see, feeds into so many other aspects of our life and becomes a very model for our life. And what we're going to talk about today, primarily, first and foremost, is our invitation to what I like to call liturgical discipleship. And we're going to talk about what that means and why I use that term, liturgical discipleship. But first, let's talk about where it all begins. And to do that, we're going to look at the very, very beginning. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26. God says, "Let us make man in our image and after our likeness." What jumps out to me when I hear this is this use of the terms us and our. Creation in the image and likeness of God, for us as Orthodox Christians, really means that we are made to be in community. We're made to be with one another because we are created in the image and likeness of a God who is by definition Trinity, a God who is by definition plural. Creation in the image and likeness of God who is plural, who in that understanding of the Trinity, knowing who the Trinity is, means that we have to be in that same mutual existence, that mutual existence of love. The Trinity is so hard to understand, so hard to describe. But what we do know is that they exist completely in love, totally working with one another, completely going for one another. This is a difficult thing to understand, especially right now. How are we together? It's hard for us to be with one another. It's hard currently. We're not even allowed in some places where you might live. You might be not even allowed to see another person outside of those that live in the same house as you. It's a very difficult thing, especially when you think about how we started. You know, many of us, no matter where we came from in the world, our experience was similar to what I like to call village life. Village life was everyone being together, everyone living together, families living right next door to each other and down the street from one another and up the street from one another, living in the same household. My mother grew up in what was called a tenement house in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. A tenement house has 3 floors, sometimes it has more, and on each floor was an entire household. So, in their experience, they typically rented out the first floor. And my grandmother's sister and her family lived on the second floor. And my grandmother and my mother's family lived on the third floor. As people started to get married and moved out, people moved. My mother's family moved to the second floor. And the third floor was kept for people that were getting married and starting their own families, a way for them to start out. What this meant was that everyone lived together. Everyone lived in community. Everyone was taking care of one another, making sure everyone was provided for. Everyone was able to make sure and check in on one another. When my grandfather died, my mom's siblings, there were 4 of them, ranged in age from 12 to 2. But because they lived in that kind of situation, they were able to have older cousins that were able to come and watch them while my grandmother went out to work to provide for the family. But as society grew and changed, we moved to what we now have as our cities, these great giant metropolises. If you live in the city of Phoenix, dense population, people living all together, one on top of the other. And it starts to get a little bit uncomfortable because there's too many people to recreate what we used to have in the village. So, what do? We create suburbs and we move back into the smaller communities. But we've done something different with these smaller communities. Rather than the village where everyone knew each other and everyone was living together, talking with one another, taking care of one another, we now live in these suburbs where we call them subdivisions. We wall them off. We sometimes have gated communities and we keep one another out. We have high walls in Phoenix to keep, animals out. But what has happened is it also keeps our neighbors out. We've moved something that we can really appreciate today into what I call society in isolation. When we're isolated, it becomes very easy to fall into a number of temptations that we're going to talk about in a minute. But it's the very thing that we're struggling with today. How do we live in isolation? I was talking with our parish priest here in Phoenix earlier today, and he said, what do we want to do today? And I said, well, I can go back home, but honestly, like, we're starting to get a little stir crazy. My wife's currently working from home. If I'm home too, while she's trying to work and I'm not really having too much, normally Monday's my day off, she's going to probably end up not being very happy with me because I'm going to want to interact because we're created in the image and likeness of a God who is plural. And she needs to focus on her work and is not able to interact. We're not able to talk to each other. We're not able to have the same kind of conversations that we normally would. The other temptations that come, or the temptations that I'd like to focus on that come with isolationism, is that we start to get stuck in our head. We start to get stuck in our heads and we end up living in a sea of isms. We start to get lost in these ideas that as we're isolated, we stop seeing the image and likeness of this God who is plural, who has created us to need one another in other people. And we start to fall down these different paths and go down these other paths that sometimes are a little dangerous to go down. The first is relativism. It's all the same. It's all the same God. Doesn't matter what you believe, it's all the same God. I got news for you. It is not all the same God. One of my favorite classes to do here at St. George with our Sunday school is when we talk about world religion, and we talk about the different religions in America and how they shape up against one another, how they differentiate. What does everyone believe? When you start to peel back the layers, it is not the same God. We see very quickly that there are some pretty specific differences about what we believe and what others might believe. So when we start to say it's all the same God because we want to have this feel good mentality where we're all the same and we're all connected, everything's okay, let's just pump the brakes a little bit, because what that ultimately leads to is what I like to call secularism. This idea that, well, if it's all the same God anyway, then none of it matters. Because then we move to humanism, which says, I just need to be nice to everyone. I just need to make sure that everyone is taken care of and that I'm just a good person, kind of the way that all the different religions talk about, because it's all the same anyway. And so I just need to be nice to each other. But the definition of what that means, what it means to be nice to one another, then is my definition of what it means to be nice to one another. I've lost this idea of having the reference point that comes from God. I start to become the reference. I become the gauge of what it means to be nice and what people need and how I should act. And then it leads me down the path of narcissism, which I like to categorize as I decide. Look out for number one. And you do you, boo boo. And if you don't believe me, go to a grocery store, go to a parking lot, and just observe. Watch everyone trying to fight for a spot, especially today in these parking lots, trying to get the best spot they can so that they can go forward, so that they can buy up all of the toilet paper that they think they need because they're hoarding it. Because we have this mentality of looking out for number one. We're not thinking about the fact that other people might need this. Other people are also struggling. Other people are also isolated. And in that isolation, other people might need these things that I'm gobbling up for myself because I've decided I need it. I'm looking out for me and I'm not worried about anyone else. By comparison, Father John Breck, who is a biblical scholar and also a bioethicist from recent years, he writes a lot about ethics, says worship gives expression to our faith. You're going to hear, as we're talking about all of this other stuff going on, like at the grocery store, and all of this craziness that we're dealing with in the world today. You might hear the word faith get thrown around a lot. Just have faith in God. Just have faith in God. Yes, have faith in God. But it is our worship that gives expression to that faith. And the expression to our faith that worship gives us, as we're going to see, is summarized beautifully in an article I read recently called Where is God in the Liturgy by Father Alexander Rentel. And he says, within the liturgy, the sign, symbol, gesture, word, and veil of the cross gives way to the revelation of God's love. It is through the cross that God shows us, that the liturgy shows us what it means to be us. What it means when we hear, let us make mankind in our image and after our likeness, which St. Basil the Great goes on to say, by our creation, we have the first. We're given the first. We're given our image freely in our creation. God just gives it to us. But by free choice, we build the second. By our free choice, by our understanding how to give ourselves over, but like we see in the cross, we build the second, our likeness. This is precisely what we talk about at St. George as crucifixional living. For those of you familiar with the Warrior Saints movement, we talk about crucifixional living all the time, which is to live a life that is for the sake of the other person, denying ourselves, taking up our own cross. Sometimes it's very difficult, but it's the very thing that Christ himself shows us to do. And I love this icon because it really shows us what it means. And there's this beautiful line in the middle of the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom where it says, "You who are the offerer, Christ, offering the offering, which is himself." Christ in the cross, we talk about as crucifixion of living, shows us what it means to be fully human by offering himself fully to one another, fully to all of us. This is what the Trinity shows us in their relationship of love. And this is what Christ calls us to do. Christ is the archetype. He is the pattern, what it means to offer ourselves fully to one another. And he does it in the Garden of Gethsemane, where there's this beautiful moment just before he's crucified. We read about it in the Gospel of John, where he is on his knees praying. And the Gospel says his sweat was like drops of blood. And he says, "Father, would that this cup would pass from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done." By free choice, when we say, "Nevertheless, not my will, but thy will be done," we ourselves, by our free choice, are building ourselves up to be in the likeness of God. This is something that we see modeled for us in the Divine Liturgy every time we have a Divine Liturgy, where the image of this self-offering that Christ shows us as his path, as his way, that they bring God to us. We often think that, or run down this temptation where we think liturgy is rude because the priest has his back to us the whole time. No, my friends, when the priests or bishops have their back to us, they are offering us to God. And when they turn and they face us, they are bringing God to us through the gospel, through their blessing. When a priest blesses someone, he's doing it with the very initials of Christ in his hand. ICXC, the initials of Christ. And he blesses us in Christ's name. He brings us Christ's body and blood in the Eucharist. And our priests and our bishops, when they bless us with the Tvikiti and Dikiti, they have 3 candles in one hand, 2 candles in the other, just like when we make the sign of the cross. And we have 3 fingers for the Trinity and 2 for the natures of Christ. They model for us, they show us as living icons, like we see here, Bishop John of Worcester, vested, standing in front of an icon of Christ who is vested. They stand as living icons of this Christ's archetypal priesthood, sharing in his priesthood, bringing his priesthood to us, which we are then called to model in our own lives through our own crucifixional living. Now, I use this term at the beginning, liturgical discipleship. So let's talk about in the Great Commission, which we hear about all over the place. We are all called to become disciples ourselves so that we can live out that life of crucifixional living for others, so that we can live out this life that Christ has shown us as his path, not our will, but the will of God. In Matthew 28, verses 19 through 20, we read, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always through the close of the age." What I see as our call to liturgical discipleship, what I see as something that we're being invited to every single day of our lives, Father Alexander Schmemann refers to as the threefold, the three-part liturgy of initiation, which is what he calls baptism. Because the actions that we see in this Great Commission, the actions that we see bringing us into this reality that is liturgical discipleship, happen within our baptism. First, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, we are baptized, which is our invitation and our calling. Teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you happens in our chrismation. Chrismation is not the culmination of teaching, not at all. Chrismation is the beginning of our learning, which is why often babies are baptized. It's not because they've learned everything, so now we let them in. It's we let them in so that they can learn everything. When my wife and I were married, we were called and we asked God, the prayers of the marriage service, asked God to give us fair children for education in the faith and in the fear of God. Children are a gift from God so that we might teach them who God is, so that they can know what it means to be created in the image and likeness of God, so that they can build up that likeness of God by their free choice, so that they can become crucifixional warrior saints who are living to be for other people, so that they're not gobbling up all of the toilet paper, but they're recognizing that maybe they just need one pack so that someone else can buy another pack themselves. And finally, he ends with the words, "Lo, I am with you always to the age. Amen." Well, how is he with us? He's with us in the Eucharist, which we receive for the first time at our baptism, which we then are allowed to receive and called to receive and given the gift to receive when we prepare for it each and every time we celebrate the divine liturgy. Perhaps the hardest thing for many of us right now is actually not being able to take communion every Sunday. We miss it. We don't know really what's going on. We're not used to this. And it's hard to understand, like, why is this happening? Why can't this happen? Why can't we just participate? Why are we being forced to be isolated? It goes against everything we know. Within the divine liturgy, as we're going to see over the next 2 weeks, these three things happen over and over again throughout the entirety of the divine liturgy. We're invited with the words, "Come, let us worship." We then are taught everything about who God is. And then we even receive Christ in the body and blood of Christ, bringing us together as the body and blood of Christ in the Eucharist. So to not be a part of that seems very odd, seems very weird, and is hard for us to understand, hard for us to deal with. I myself am struggling with it. But the reality is, this is a cross that we're being called to bear. And we're finding new and unique ways to participate and to actually feel like we're participating with one another. Yesterday, our church live streamed all of our Orthros and Divine Liturgy. And I checked a couple times as the stream was running. I was overwhelmed by how many people were joining. I was overwhelmed by how many people were joining in. That despite not being able to be physically together, we still had all of this happening. Christ was still able to be there with us. And Christ was able to be our focus. Christ was able to be our anchor as we're getting lost in all of this chaos, this sea of tribulations. And it is Christ who raises us from that chaos as our anchor, showing us constantly in his very being, by being who he is, what it means to be created in the image and likeness of God, what it means to live for others. So my challenge for you, and the way that we'll end, is to know that you are the now of the church. And the whole point of understanding our liturgical discipleship is so that we can look at how this three-part liturgy of initiation is played out each and every divine liturgy so that you can find your now. You can find how God is calling you to that crucifixion of life so that you can see how God is reaching out to you and bringing you closer to him. The way that he calls Peter out to walk on the water in the Gospel of Matthew and brings each and every one of us out to him on the water, on the sea of chaos. When Peter walks on the water towards Christ, he keeps his eyes on Christ. When he takes his eyes off of Christ, he begins to sink. Keep our eyes on Christ. Keep your eyes on that anchor. And we too will be able to see through our own practicing of crucifixion living, through our own understanding of our liturgical discipleship, how Christ is calling each and every one of us. I hope this is helpful for you. We look forward to seeing you next week. We're going to have other teachings here at St. George through a wide variety of places. We'll be on facebook.com/warrior saints, facebook.com/stgeorgephx, youtube.com/warrior saints, and we'll be streaming everything also on our church website, www.stgeorgeaz.org/live stream. If you don't go to the live stream, you'll see on our main page a banner that says COVID-19 Survival Series. So we welcome you to tune in, and that'll take you to the live stream. Do we have any questions that got popped in, Deacon? Thank you. Well, it's okay. And for those of you watching on YouTube, if you didn't check this out live and want to ask a question later, you can pop it into the comment section on YouTube and we'll make sure we'll answer it, or direct message it through any of the other channels that we have, facebook.com/warrior saints or facebook.com/uh, St. George Phoenix, or if you want to send them directly to the Department of Missions and Evangelism, I'm sure Deacon Adam will share them. Fantastic. We'll see you guys next week on Monday at 11 o'clock Pacific Standard Time or Mountain Standard Time, same bat channel.